Alright, this is a lower gauge cluster out of a 1982 to 83 Ford EXP or Mercury LN7. As far as I know, those are the only two cars that these things came in. They're kind of problem childs because the oil pressure gauge is rarely accurate. It's almost never accurate, and it's never consistent. So at least it's never consistent. And the ammeter does absolutely nothing. In all my cars, whether the battery is bad or the alternator is bad or everything's good, the needle doesn't do anything but sit in the middle. Whether the car is running or not, it just sits in the middle. It does absolutely nothing. So I don't know if that's intentional on Ford's end or if that was an accidental thing. So, I don't know if they make these gauges and they're supposed to do nothing, or maybe they all just fail after 100 miles or something, but it's ridiculous. So we're going to make both of them more reliable, and what we're going to do, at least in this video, is we're going to make the electronic oil pressure gauge a mechanical one, so it's far more reliable. And the ammeter gauge will someday turn into a voltmeter gauge, because I don't need to know how many amps I'm drawing at any point. I just need to know if my alternator's charging and if my battery is holding that charge. So that's easy stuff. So if the needle's all the way on the left, I know that the car is off. If the needle's on the over D for discharge, I know that the battery is dying when I have it in auxiliary. If it's at D when it's running, I know the alternator is dying. If it's in the center, then I know that my battery is strong, but maybe my alternator isn't. And if it's closer to the C for charging, I know that everything's a go. But like I said, we'll do that someday. So to disassemble these, it's just 3 screws. These little guys. It's a 1/4-inch head screw in just 1, 2, 3 places. Once you do that, the clear lens comes off. You can actually take the black bezel off with it behind it. And then underneath that is a lens for your idiot lights. Pretty cool. So now you're down to the nitty-gritty with the gauges. These are the 2 gauges, like I said. We'll flip it over so you can see this better. An important note is whenever handling these, don't ever touch the white ink silkscreen on these. Touching it with anything, it will smear. Due to how these age, the white printing just does funny things. Anyone with the turn signal stocks could tell you what that's like. We'll flip it over, and it kind of looks like this, with the addition of these 2 nuts over our oil gauge. So these would normally be right there. That's what provides the oil pressure gauge with power. Because like I said, it's electric, not mechanical. So what it does is it uses electrical current from a sending unit that is bolted onto the block into an oil galleyway. So as that sending unit it receives pressure, it emits an electric signal, and that goes straight into this gauge. So this is a gauge without the facade on it. So this is just the literal gauge. And there's a needle here, and the signal comes in through one of these 2 lines, goes into that set of windings, and then that set of windings will actually move this U-shaped arm back and forth, thus moving the needle. You can see minuscule actions will actually move the needle quite a lot. And then you can adjust it in a few different ways. On the back side, you can stick a number 1 Phillips screwdriver into that top hole or this bottom hole, twist it either direction, moves those teeth, which pivots the needle forward or backwards to adjust its range and its resting spot, which is pretty interesting. You shouldn't ever need to do that. By the time you need to do that, your gauge is getting tired. It won't be reliable by the time you need to do that. But if you find a new one and you feel you have to have a new old stock one in it, you want to adjust that right away when you install it. But I strongly recommend getting a mechanical oil pressure gauge because then it actually works. Like I said, it's just those two guys that hold your gauge on. They're 5/16 or 1/8 inch, 8 millimeter. And then your gauge comes right off. Pretty neat, pretty clever. And then how you disassemble this is you have to remove the faceplate. Now, the faceplate is held on in just a few spots. You can see it's got 3 squeezed plastic tabs that fit fine around the shell that has 3 indents around it. But they also plastic weld, or I should say they melt the plastic of the bezel to the shell of the gauge, and they do it in 3 spots. You can see it's melted there by my finger, there on the far left, and over here on the far right. Pretty much all you have to do to separate the facade from the actual gauge is to either melt those melted spots already or pry them with a small flathead screwdriver. I prefer prying them. The plastic's really thick, so you could melt them. However, there's no guarantee that you won't deform this in a permanent way, because these guys, as far as I know, don't exist. It's rare that you can find the gauge set, the whole assembled unit, all as one on eBay. It's pretty rare. And these individual gauges, I don't think they're the same as the other 80s Fords, so finding just the facade alone is next to impossible. Finding one that hasn't been faded horribly is really hard too. But once you have the facade off, you're more or less left with this, plus the 2 studs on the back. I'll show you that. There's those 2 studs. That's what is used to collect that oil pressure signal from the sending unit. And then of course it's got that nylon insulator on it. And then they solder 2 wires, very thin wires, you might not be able to see. 2 very thin wires, each one goes onto these. And then that sends electricity into this bar to allow the needle to move back and forth, like so. So it's pretty neat, just not reliable. And then that's pretty much it. If you want to, you can remove the needle. I'll show you on the easier one to see. It's just held in with 2 tangs through a hole in it. So you move that bottom tang up and then you finagle the needle out. It's kind of weird, but that's something you have to consider if you want to use that needle on an aftermarket gauge. So I'll show you my aftermarket gauge. This is one that I installed just this weekend. It looks nice, fairly stock. Aside from the scrum bit down here and the shape of the needle being off, it looks pretty nice. What I did was I used a generic mechanical oil pressure gauge from like a normal triple cluster. nothing too fancy, but it's very accurate, surprisingly, and it's very consistent, which is what I'm more concerned about. Being consistent and reliable. It doesn't need to be totally accurate, it just needs to be consistent and reliable. So how did I do this? Well, the gauge it comes in is in a larger pod. A bunch larger. Maybe you can't see it all that well on camera, but it's a fair bit larger. But the facade for these gauges are exactly the same size as the original gauges, which is neat, because what that means is I can use the facade of the new gauges to mount my old facades onto. So that's what I did. Just remember, on these original ones, they're made to fit perfectly around the gauge, and then they just mount the ends over. That's what I did here. Fits perfectly around the gauge facade. All I had to do was grind out a few divots for those 3 dimples that they put in the plastic facade, and then I curled the melted parts back over with a screwdriver because I didn't remove them. I only bent them out so I could pop it off. Then I also had to remove the little stopper screw that they put on these. That little guy. I'm not sure why they put that on there. I think they just do that to keep the needle from pinging off. Or when you have excessively high oil pressure, this thing isn't bouncing off the charts, freaking people out. I couldn't tell you which. But those are 2 possibilities. Anyhow, like I said, these have a bigger gauge shell, or surround, I should say. So it took a fair bit of retrofitting, and probably my biggest issue, if I were to ever do this again, I will be at some point looking around at different mechanical gauges that have the oil inlet in a different spot, because with it being at the bottom, it makes it really hard to fit inside the cluster without hitting the electrical connector for everything. But this one works barely. It barely fits in there and lines up with the outside gauge facades. It barely works. But that was quite the engineering feat on my part to do so. But I still haven't even plugged anything in to know how well it will clear or not. Because maybe I have to grind the bottom of this yet. I'll let you know in the description when I get to installing this. But this gauge uses its own pressed-in studs, so I had to remove those. Here, I have those right here. It had these guys pressed into these holes. You can see that they're too far apart. What I did was I took the original gauge and I removed this nylon insulator and then clipped the 2 wires that are soldered to these 2 posts. To remove this nylon spacer and the 2 posts, you just have to bend these 2 tangs outwards and then it'll just pull right off, no problem. And then I carefully measured and drilled some holes. I stuck those back in from the inside so it would save me some space. So when I put these back in here, all I have to do is put a nut on them, tighten them down, secure it, and then we're good to go. But this shell I had to shrink. It stands up pretty tall. So I cut a pretty thick ring off of it, just so it would fit behind the bezels. And it barely clears right now. It kind of stinks. I can't go much further because of how this oil inlet is. That's what the facade mounts to, and the actual gauge inner workings mounts to. It mounts onto the shell through just that brass oil inlet. Pretty weird like that. But I was able to slip the old gauge facade right over the new one. Bent the needle outward some so it won't ever touch my old facade, scratch it or anything. And then someday I'll glue the old needle on it, so then it looks correct. But otherwise, the sweep turned out perfect. I did have to hog out the holes where this mounts, just so I can move it higher up. So that's why I did. Hog those suckers out because they're supposed to be small like that. I made them substantially bigger so I could play around with the distance up and down, side to side, and then I can turn it some because the stock ones aren't always aligned well. And then I have that oil inlet to deal with. And that brought its own challenges. What I had to do is, don't worry, it looks worse than it seems. Take my word on that. It's worse than it looks worse than it is. What I did was I had cut the wire, the traces. And I didn't cut through the copper, of course. That'd be dumb. But I cut in the blank spots of the traces so that I could bend out this section so I could have my oil feed here. And that's why I said if I had a chance to do it over again, because I will be doing more of these, I'd rather have the oil feed somewhere in the middle or further up the top, because now my trace has to be kinked like this, which is totally fine because once I have it fully assembled and in the car, it'll only be sticking out at a perpendicularly like that. I just had one issue with one of the traces popping off, but I can definitely try to melt that in there or glue it back on, something like that. But worst case scenario, that's just the light for door ajar. And in my daily driver, I'm not too concerned about it. Oh no, when the door is open, it's hard to miss when your door is open because you get so much wind noise and rattling and everything else because it's an old car. Plus you get the door buzzer in case you really left it open. But that's all I did, was I just cut around the traces so I could bend it forward like this, and that left me with enough room to make a decent sized hole so that I can fit this thing in there without much issue. So that's what I did. With these mechanical fuel gauges, this one is pretty neat. Beyond this I keep saying fuel, oil inlet is just a copper band that stretches about 3/4 of the way around the thing, starting down here, coming up and around, and ending here. And it's all soldered shut, but it's neat because as oil pressure fills it up, it tries straightening that band, which moves this needle further up, showing a high oil pressure. Pretty cool. But you have to be very careful making these, because any bend, dent, kink, or whatever you make on any part of this will affect its function. So I did my darndest keeping the resting place of this needle close to where it was on the gauge it came on, the aftermarket set. And then I double checked the range of my original facade to make sure that it fits the range of my oil pressure. So here down low at low, where that L is, that is about 25 psi, 25 to 30 psi, and where that H is, that's about 60, 70. The gauge only goes up to 80. That's your danger zone. So when you see the needle go off, you're making a little too much. at least for this motor. That's plenty. It's too much. That's blockage. But that's pretty much it. Aligning it was kind of, a pain. But when you make it perfect, it's perfect, and it's on there real nice and snug. The old facade will never separate from that new facade, which is great. But I'll throw it back in the shebang like that. So looks like that now. I'll quickly grab my facade. I only have a few seconds left of camera memory to do this for you, so you can see how it looks fully assembled. Someday, real soon, before it goes back in the car, I will be painting the needles. But that's how it looks. It's kind of interesting. Ford offsets these needles so they look like that from the driver's seat. Otherwise, anywhere else they look kind of funny. But from the driver's seat, it looks great. So if I find a better aftermarket oil pressure gauge to use, I will include that in the link. And as soon as I figure out which this one is, I'll include that in the link. But otherwise, works great. I just have to extend that oil feed line so it's easier to install.